visual understanding of what the medium is, the title, the author, the subtitle, a fee. That's basically it. Fill out a form. It's very simple. If it's so simple, then,
why not do it more often?
Yeah.
No, I really think it's
just a cultural thing on some levels. Yeah, so. It's just a culture.
I think they're perhaps too lazy to do this small thing.
Or they just don't know.
Some won't know, and some won't do it even if they do know.
Some don't know, and some don't care.
Probably.
Yeah. Cool. Well, let's take a break here. We'll be back in a moment. Don't go away.
As China's role grows greater on the global stage, you want to stay up to date on the issues most pressing to China both domestically and internationally. Check out the Just China podcast for in-depth analysis on recent headlines and investigative reports on Chinese matters that affect our globalized world. We are Just China. Find us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy your podcast listening.
And we're back with Klaus Krebs of Claro and Cia law firm in Santiago, Chile. This is a question I wanted to ask is, what does your daily work as a copyright attorney entail? Like, what are the daily things that you do? Do you talk with artists, daily, or different clients? People come to you. What does your work look like?
Usually our firm deals more with actually corporations, companies. So usually questions come more related to agreements, contracts with artists, or protection of rights, but from a more corporate perspective. Actually, we have not worked much with artists, but this is just because of what our firm does. I mean, and the clients with whom we are involved. We have had a few cases, and one was actually very interesting, with a well-known comedian and radio host here, and it was part copyright thing and part trademark thing, because he was with a radio station for many years and then wanted to change to another station, and the first station for which he worked many years tried to retain all the rights to even his artistic name, and so he couldn't appear in the news show that he was hosting using the name under which he was famous. And so that was very, very interesting and a lot of fun being a comedian, our client. So you can imagine that.
What was the name of the case?
His name is Willy Sabor, which is Willy Flavor. So yeah, it was funny.
How did the case end up?
Well, he is now still entitled to use his name, because there was a large dispute which ended actually at the Copyright Office, because his name was registered there as a pseudonym. Well, in the end, what was most relevant to decide this was that he had an actual registration for his pseudonym with the Copyright Office. So in this case, that allowed him to keep on with his name.
So most of your work is transactional in nature. That means you're either filling out applications or you're looking through the law to make sure that an application matches what the copyright is for, or a lot of it is, instead of doing that, it's more informing the corporations of what their rights are, how they should proceed with different actions or perhaps promotions and advertisements and things like that.
Yes, both of that, and also reviewing agreements and structuring rights, that kind of thing.
My understanding is that the majority of the copyrights that are done, the vast majority, probably almost 70% of the copyrights that are done in Chile are literary in nature. So mainly books and maybe some scripts for TV and movies and stuff like that. Some music, so about maybe 25% tops. But what does that mean in the society that most of the things are literary, not necessarily art and things like that are being copyrighted? What does that mean for the distribution of copyrights?
I think it has mostly to do with that we do have a pretty developed and strong publishing industry. There is a lot of publishing here. There are quite a few national publishing companies. I think there's also a lot of pride in what our literature has been. I mean, having 2 Nobel Prizes for us is always something that is in everybody's mind. And I think it probably simply has to do with the fact that this is an established industry, that they know well that registering the copyrights of books and of other published works is an important part of the publishing process, and they take advantage of the system in that way. So perhaps that explains more than anything else that makes up the majority of the registered copyrighted works.
For multinational corporations and record companies that are working across borders and all of these things, when they're copywriting things, is there one centralized way of copywriting it, or do you have to actually go into every country and copyright? Or if you copyright something, and if you register your copyright at least in the United States, is it worthwhile still doing so in Chile, or only if a problem shows up?
Well, it could be worthwhile if you expect, for instance, at some point that any kind of dispute or other controversy or litigation is going to arise with respect to that copyrighted work. I mean, if you expect that this is going to happen locally, then you should also register that copyright locally, because in local courts, that local registration is what is going to help you most, more than a foreign registration, even though that will help too to establish your right. The works of foreign creators are recognized here based on international treaties, and most of these treaties nowadays involve almost all of the world, so there should be no problem in that. But if you really want to enforce your rights here and you fear that there's going to be any kind of controversy around your copyright locally, then you should definitely register it.
When would a copyright holder want to let a copyright infringement go through? For example, when would a musician want people to not necessarily steal their music, but do things with it that they have the right to say you shouldn't do this? Are there other situations you can think of that it's worthwhile to do that?
You mean when the copyright holder would simply allow other people to use?
Yeah, I mean, for example, you have a copyright or a corporation has a copyright, and then without asking permission, someone just goes ahead and does something. When is it useful to litigate? When is it not useful to litigate? Are there pros and cons, benefits and costs that a company or just a general copyright holder has to consider when thinking about whether to pursue enforcement of their copyright?
I think here you would, to assess that, you would look firstly and mainly at the profile of the infringer. Yeah. Because as I said, we live in a country that is still developing, and there is a lot of poverty, and much of the trademark or the copyright infringement, you can explain that because people sometimes resort to anything to make a living. And even if you sue or do whatever, you know that you won't obtain much in return. So sometimes it's simply not worth it. And so I think you would get into litigation if it has some public relevance, or if you can really expect that the case would have a result that would benefit you in more than simply getting some money in return.
My understanding is that in a lot of cases, in a lot of the law in Chile, there's not a lot of punitive damages. Typically, things are not. It's mainly compensatory. You get what is needed to make yourself whole, but generally it's not, we're going to punish you to set an example for everyone else.
No, punitive damages are not part of the system here.
So what happens if, there's people who are doing copyright infringement? In the United States, there was very, very symbolically this case of Napster. So Napster was a company, and people were using Napster to steal as much music as they possibly could. And then I think it was something like Metallica sued Napster, and Napster went out of business. And so this was a big symbolic case, because if they had just been for the amount of money that was stolen, maybe they could have paid it back. But by putting huge, huge fines and forcing Napster essentially to to declare bankruptcy and I think liquidate, although I think Napster in some form still does exist. All of these other companies that were thinking about doing this totally stopped doing it and really cracked down on infringement. So what ability is there for deterrence of crimes of this nature when it's only a compensatory damage scheme?
No, the thing is that here it's also, you can also start criminal actions here. And I think that is the main deterrent, more than, and in fact, in cases such as this, I guess that is what first and foremost is done. I mean, start a criminal action. That criminal action in this case even means that you can spend some time in jail if you infringe it to a significant degree. So, yeah, that is perhaps the main way here.
My understanding is that a lot of the damage is actually, it's not like a fixed fine. It's not, $300 for this infringement, $200 for that infringement. A lot of it has to depend on your mens rea, so how, guilty you are, so to speak, and then also to the extent and whether there was anything that was aggravating about it.
Yes.
Is this what you're talking about in terms of it can bump it up from some kind of civil wrong to a criminal wrong?
There is a distinction between payment of a fine, which goes to the state, and that will simply the amount of that is in a fixed range, but it will depend on several considerations that will make some cases worse than others. But that is different from the damages for which you could sue, which have more to do with the loss or what you did not receive, what you failed to receive because of the activity of the infringer.
Well, I was wondering if you could just tell me a little bit about the public domain system in Chile and what that means and how it works, and if there's anything significant that's different about it from the United States.
Perhaps you can tell me how it works in the United States.
Sure. So my understanding is that you theoretically could give up your copyright if you wanted to. Most people don't. So you could cede something to the public domain before you need to. But as time has gone on, the length of copyrights before the death of the author has increased. I think it's very similar in Chile, although there were a few times when it went up and down. But I believe that now it's your work is copyrighted until 70 years after the death of the author, and then it goes into the public domain.
Yes.
And I have a feeling that it's very, very similar in Chile, but I was wondering if, there are some aspects to it that are a little bit different. For example, I heard that there's a few exceptions. For example, there's one exception for the widow. So there's a widow exception where it can be extended past 70 years after the death of the author in the case of a widow who's unemployed.
Yeah, the thing is, that was part of the system before it changed a few years ago. So there are still a few people subject to copyright under previous legal systems.
They're grandfathered in.
Exactly. And there used to be provisions like what you say, which made it very difficult to calculate or to ascertain when actually a copyright expired, when a certain work went into the public domain, because that was also already an acquired right under a previous system. So in that way, the current legislation has simplified that a lot. I mean, it's a long time. 70 years is perhaps too long for my taste, at least. But at least the system is now more simple in that you can, better than it used to be in Chile, tell when a specific work has gone into the public domain.
Great. Well, let's take one more short break. We'll have another short segment after this. Stay tuned and don't go away.
Hey, UC3P listeners. I'm Thomas.
And I'm Nick.
In the United States, public faith in the military remains sky high, while trust in other government institutions sinks to an all-time low.
At the same time, fewer than 1% of Americans will ever serve in the armed forces, and the cultural divide between active duty troops and the civilian population continues to widen.
UC3P presents a new series, Thank You for Your Service, where we take a deep dive into the complex world of civil-military affairs.
We'll address the politicization of the military, defense policy in the news, and the importance of staying informed in a democracy.
Join us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts as we explore how our professional military institution relates to the society it serves.
And we're back with Klaus Krebs of Claro and Cia, a